We are. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China in the World program here at Columbia University. And today is our second event of the semester in our speaker series. We have a very special guest, an old friend of the program and a very loyal alum of the program, of whom we are very proud. And she is Yeling Tan, and she is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Oregon. She's also a non-resident fellow at the University of California, San Diego in their Contemporary China Center. Yeling came to us from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where she has both an MPA and a PhD. She's published in multiple referee journals, including the China Journal, and she has this wonderful book at Cornell University Press in their political economy series. It's called Disaggregating China, Inc., State Strategies in a Liberal Economic Order. That's the topic of our talk today, and I know you're in for a real treat because she's presented her research here as a fellow and in our annual conferences as well. And it really does combine what the program emphasizes, which is a kind of theoretical take on the way that China interacts with the world, with a very careful set of research projects to back up the various claims, including field research in China. And we're just very proud to have her, and she's fulfilling one of the other goals of the program, which is she's an active teaching professor at a university, educating the next generation of citizens about China's rise and its importance in the world. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Yeling. Thanks very much, Yeling, for coming. It's great to have you back. It'd be even better if you were back in person, but it's great to have you back in this format as well. So I'll turn it over to you, and I will sign my picture out. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks, Daniel. I wanted to start by saying a big thank you to the China in the World program for this really, really kind invitation to speak. It's always an honor and a pleasure to take part in CWP events, but I have to say this occasion is extra special to me, even though it's a little bit sad that it's virtual, because it's extra special to me because it's thanks to the China in the World program that I could spend a very fruitful postdoc year at that point in time. I was at Princeton, turning my dissertation into a publishable book. And through these various CWP events that, Tom, you mentioned just now, I've gotten really tremendous feedback from the CWP community and beyond on various chapters. So I'm incredibly excited to be able to show and talk about this final product today. And I'm really looking forward to a fun discussion. Okay, so let's get into the book. So when China joined the World Trade Organization 20 years ago in 2001, the mood both in China and the rest of the world was jubilant, as this picture shows. Expectations were really high that this event would usher in a new era of liberalization in the Chinese economy, and that through a common set of rules and mutually beneficial economic exchange, WTO entry would peacefully integrate a rising China into the international order. So Bill Clinton, putting his case forward for China's WTO entry back in the year 2000, argued that under the WTO, some of China's most important decisions for the first time will be subject to the review of international bodies with rules and binding dispute settlement. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers similarly argued that same year that, quote, by learning to play by the rules, China will strengthen the rule of law, which will enable it to become a more reliable partner and a fairer society. So why were these expectations so high? This was in part due to the strength and depth of China's commitments to the WTO. As part of its protocol of accession, the first page of which you see there on the slide, China promised a whole slew of commitments. It promised to let the market, rather than the state, set prices for most goods. It promised to liberalize the right to trade to all firms, not just state-owned enterprises. It promised to improve the disclosure of information around economic policies, to commit to non-intervention in the operation of the market, to non-discrimination between foreign and domestic firms, to setting up institutions for the independent regulation of the market, and to strengthening the rule of law in the overall governance of the Chinese economy. In short, these commitments amounted to no less than a Herculean effort to transform China's economy from one rooted in state planning to one operating based on market forces. Now, fast forward 20 years to today, and the liberal internationalist promise of integration appears to have been replaced with disappointment and discontent. In 2018, the Trump administration declared that it was a mistake to have allowed China into the WTO. And recent years since then have seen the number of dispute cases at the WTO involving China steadily increase. China has also clashed with the EU and the United States over its status as a non-market economy. The US and EU have shifted their postures to treating China as a strategic competitor. Sanctions on Chinese companies Huawei and ZTE, as well as a trade war that sees no end, have raised concerns that the world is headed towards a decoupling of its two largest economies. Very importantly, this discontent with China is bipartisan, so economic tensions have continued into the Biden administration, with both the US Trade Representative and Commerce Secretary sticking to the use of tariffs against China. And just earlier this month, the US has started considering a new Section 301 investigation that might lead to more tariffs against China in the future. So in contrast to the integrationist expectations of 2 decades ago, a new conventional wisdom appears to have formed around China and the global trading system. They are, first, that the WTO has failed to alter China's economic model. Second, that China is instead building a state capitalist model. And third, that this model is being exported globally through Chinese SOEs and state industrial policy. So in my talk today, I am going to question much of this conventional wisdom. And my argument will push against categorizing China and Chinese behavior into these binary categories. Why is this important? Well, first, there are real limits to thinking about China's WTO experience as either a success or a failure. It overlooks the question of when liberalizing reforms did take place and why. And it also disregards the puzzles of when those reforms slowed down and why. More broadly, political science literature tends to categorize state responses into binaries: protection versus liberalization, or compliance versus defiance. And these frameworks, to me, tend to impose binaries on state behavior when in fact the choices available to states are actually wide-ranging. They can choose from a great variety of policy instruments when considering how to respond to global rules. Instead, I argue that we have to consider how state responses to global rules are mediated by state structure and mediated by politics within the state. Now, why do we care about politics within the state? Because the main burden of adjustment to WTO entry fell on China's massive state apparatus. I quote here from a magazine interview with a Central Party school official back in 2001. And he said, WTO entry is an important strategic move for our country's economic development, but also brings along with it a problem, which is how the party in its decision and policymaking process can defend China's national interest and socialist principles while fulfilling international norms and WTO rules. He goes on to say, the biggest shock of the WTO to China is aimed at our government, and we are a government governed by a single party. So in reality, the ones who will feel the shock will be the party's administrative and leadership methods. Now, one might argue that, because China is governed by a single party, what we need to look at is basically what the leadership thinks. Does the leadership want to implement reform or not? Does it want to comply with WTO rules or not? But I argue in the book that the bureaucracy and other political actors within the state can often make things hard or easy for the leadership. And here I quote from Deng Xiaoping himself, who said, "Once a political line is established, someone must implement it. And depending on who is in charge of implementation, those who support the party's line, those who do not, or those who take the middle of the road position, the results will be different." So it's really important to pay attention to the WTO's impact on intrastate politics in China. So this brings me to the two main research questions that structure the book. First, what are the range of strategies that the state can adopt to engage with WTO entry and WTO rules? And secondly, why did some parts of the Chinese state adopt more liberalizing reforms than others in response to WTO entry? So starting with the first question on the range of strategies, to consider this, we have to begin with China's history of reform and opening, which was very much a non-linear process involving policy experimentation and an incremental approach to liberalizing the economy, as much literature has documented. China's leaders created spaces for new policies around the planned economy rather than replacing it outright. So new agencies were created to lead reforms alongside old ones. And the result of this layered approach to change is that older mindsets and policies remained in the governing system, even as China's economy took off. So there was no agreement within the vast party state over how to govern the economy despite rapid economic growth. Broadly, I propose that we can think about these various disagreements over governance as coalescing around three competing modes of economic governance. The first is what I call the directive strategy, which you can think of as being market substituting in nature. It relies on administrative guidance and state allocation of resources rooted in China's command economy. One example of a directive strategy would be the setting of production targets for firms rather than letting the market drive production outcomes. The second is a developmental strategy, which is market shaping in nature. The strategy here involves the use of state incentives to attract firm activity from one sector to another sector. One example might be tax breaks to draw firms towards, for example, high value-added, high-tech sectors. And the third is what I call a regulatory strategy, which is market enhancing in nature. Here, the state acts to set and enforce rules that enhance the functioning of the market. So, for example, in setting standards that enhance the interoperability of firms and products within the economy. And here, market outcomes will really depend on firm competition with each other within these rules. Now, these various competing modes of governance within China are further, the disagreements are further exacerbated by China's political structure, which is commonly described in terms of fragmented authoritarianism, where multiple sub-state actors have the ability and the authority to influence economic policies. And here I'm talking not just about political leaders, but also central economic agencies and subnational governments and so on. And this means that even within China's authoritarian regime, the incentives of these various actors are often misaligned. They're often opposed to each other. And that means that China's economic development is often the product of this internal political contestation rather than the result of a coordinated master plan. The effects of globalization and WTO entry, therefore, will be mediated by China's fragmented state structure and its internal bureaucratic politics. So this leads me now to elaborate on the main question of the book, which examines why some parts of the state adopted more liberalizing reforms than others in response to WTO entry. And here the book examines a series of dynamics that played out across different parts of China's vast and highly complex state structure. First, the book looks at China's WTO trajectories across administrative levels in China's hierarchical state. And in the following empirical chapter, it unpacks the political responses within the powerful central government in order to explain what's come to be called Chinese state capitalism and the rise of state capitalism. And finally, it looks across industries to examine how WTO entry affected China's quest to build national champions. While this analysis, as I've just laid out, you can see it's multidimensional, the theory I propose to explain China's policy trajectories is simple. WTO entry introduces two sets of new conditions that actors within the state have to respond to. The first is open competition brought about by economic liberalization. And the second is a new set of bureaucratic rules stipulating how the state should govern the economy. And these new conditions have a profound impact in changing the incentives of actors within the Chinese state, which, although governed by a single party, is highly competitive internally. So I propose the ways in which various bureaucratic actors respond to these new conditions depend in very broad terms on the probability of being sanctioned and the prospects for political advancement. And within this very simple cost-benefit framework, I show that the channels for sanction and advancement vary depending on where an actor sits within China's complex state structure, to then affect whether the policy responses that one observes are directive or developmental or regulatory. Now, in order to capture the use of these different state strategies across different parts of the state and over time, what I did was I collected an original data set of economic policies scraped from the internet in China, containing laws and regulations issued by all arms of the central and subnational governments. The data set covers over 120 manufacturing sectors, spanning the period from 1978 to 2014, making up a corpus of over 43,000 industrial policies, decisions, regulations, laws, guidances, and so on. And what this corpus basically contains is the ordinary language of China's economic bureaucracy. And then I use machine learning to uncover the topics that are latent in these documents to identify the changing prevalence of directive policies, developmental policies, and regulatory policies over time and across different parts of the bureaucracy, and combine that evidence with evidence from interviews, speeches, party documents, and so on. So that's just a quick preview of the methodology of the book. Now I want to bring you through the three main empirical chapters of the book and the main findings. And I want to start by looking at the hierarchical politics of WTO entry. So I propose that how the central and subnational governments responded to WTO entry depends firstly on how accountable each authority is to the WTO. And secondly, on whether the industrial diversity of each of these units meant that WTO entry either increased opportunities for export or raised the threat of import competition. And what I find, first of all, is that the central government responded to WTO entry with a surge in market-enhancing, liberalizing policy. So this figure that you see shows the results of the textual analysis that I described just now, of the policies issued by the central government, the provincial governments, and sub-provincial governments over the reform period. The solid line that you see shows the prevalence of market-enhancing language in the central government's policies over time. The dashed line shows the prevalence for provincial governments, and the dotted line is for the local governments in China, counties and prefectures and so on. And what you see is that prior to WTO entry, there isn't really a trend that distinguishes the regulatory language of policies issued by these three levels of government. After WTO entry, we see a stark divergence. There's a big increase in the market-enhancing content of the central government's policies, more so than provincial governments, and the lowest prevalence that you see there in local government policies. What lies behind this big divergence? Well, much of this liberalizing response that we see from the central government is driven by its very high degree of accountability to the WTO. Unlike provinces, counties, and townships, the Beijing government plays the role of sovereign representative of China at the WTO. It has to account for its policies to the other WTO member governments. So in the years immediately following WTO entry, what we see is the central government engaging in a legislative overhaul to strengthen market institutions in China. Numerous laws were reformed, over 20,000 technical standards were reviewed to bring China into conformity with WTO rules. A national campaign was launched to raise WTO awareness in the national bureaucracy and in the public. Now, what stands in contrast to this energetic push towards strengthening market institutions in China by the central government is the response by subnational governments. As I'll show you in these two figures here, provincial governments responded to WTO entry by strengthening their developmental market shaping policies, while local governments strengthened their directive market substituting policies. Now, what lies behind these different types of behavior? Well, these subnational governments are, on the one hand, shielded from direct accountability to the WTO. The city of Ningbo, for example, right, if it enacts a WTO inconsistent policy, it's not going to be directly held to account at the WTO. On the other hand, these very same subnational authorities are directly exposed to the economic effects of WTO-led competition. So those who found that they could compete to expand their exports and take advantage of market opening from WTO entry, such as Anhui province, it could be seen issuing industrial policies to spur provincial exports in strategic industries, such as auto manufacturing. Those who were not as competitive, such as many of China's smaller prefectures and rural inland regions that didn't have as rich of an industrial mix, instead resorted to directive policies to forcibly restructure their industries, to consolidate, and to eliminate inefficient firms. And therefore, what we see is that there was no monolithic response to WTO entry across these different administrative levels of government in China. While WTO entry triggered initial sweeping efforts to institute market enhancing policies, these were by and large led by the central government. Subnational authorities adopted contradictory strategies, and that led to this stark internal divergence in China's WTO policy trajectories. Now, turning to the next chapter of the book, I examine the politics within China's very powerful central state to explain the rise of what has come to be called state capitalism. So while the central government responded, as I just showed you, to WTO entry with this initial surge of market enhancing reform, this momentum soon lost steam. Instead, analysts started to point to this phenomenon of 国进民退, or the state advances while the private sector retreats, as central policies began to take on more developmental tones. So the question then is, what explains this shift in the central government's trajectories? Why did it shift, and why did it shift what explains the timing of this shift? And what you'll see is that the dominant explanation one tends to hear regarding this question are first that the 2008 financial crisis sparked China's turn towards statism, or second, that the Hu Wen leadership had more status preferences than their predecessors. And in the book, I discuss why both of these explanations are inadequate. As I'll show shortly, the turn towards state capitalism actually preceded the financial crisis by a couple of years, and explanations focused on leadership preferences tend to assume that the bureaucracy always acts as faithful agents of the leadership. It tends to overemphasize the ideological differences between the two sets of leaders. And very importantly, it doesn't explain the exact timing of the shift in China's economic policies. Instead, I argue that the shift was driven by a combination of domestic and international factors. walking through these systematically. Domestically, one has to consider the accountability relations between the party leadership and the central government, which affect whether or not the leadership can discipline the bureaucracy and deploy the central government as a faithful agent. Internationally, one has to consider the degree to which reform-minded agencies within Beijing could use WTO rules as external leverage in order to gain influence over the industrial policy agencies who were opposed to liberalization. And what I find is that during the Jiang Zemin-Zhu Rongji era, from roughly 1998 to the end of 2002, early 2003, the leadership could effectively discipline its central bureaucracy. This is in part because their support networks are located outside of Beijing in places such as Shanghai. So leaders could discipline central officials without necessarily also hurting the members of their network. This meant that the Jiang and Zhu years were marked by many reforms that directly opposed central bureaucratic interests. One example was Zhu Rongji's 抓大放小 campaign to reform China's ailing state-owned enterprises, which led to this massive consolidation and a fall in the number of SOEs in the economy within a span of just a few years. Another example would be the 1998 administrative restructuring of the central government, where Zhu Rongji managed to halve the number of civil servants in Beijing and cut the number of ministries from 40 down to 29. And the third example, of course, would be WTO entry itself, which was met with fierce resistance by the central bureaucracy that was not only wary of the negative impact of external competition on the economy, but also rather hostile to the prospect of this external scrutiny over their policy making. At the same time, the initial post-entry years in China were marked by very strong WTO leverage. And in fact, it was this external leverage that enabled Zhu Rongji to push for WTO entry, as Zhu Rongji's own domestic support for liberalization at that point in time was quite weak. So he had to reach for external rules to strengthen his hand domestically. China had also committed to a clear timetable for implementing many of its WTO commitments. This timetable was written into the accession protocol. So after WTO accession, technocratic agencies within China that supported WTO entry could use the timetable as leverage to keep the reform efforts going. This was aided by the status of international law in China's legal system, where international commitments have the standing of domestic laws. This is very different from, say, the system in the US, where international commitments have to be supported by an additional layer of domestic laws that have to be enacted in order to have any force. As the years passed, however, both party-state accountability and WTO leverage started to shift. So when we moved to the Hu Wen era, the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao leadership was different from that of Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji in that their ability to discipline the central bureaucracy was relatively weak. Hu and Wen instead had to rely on the central state as a key political constituency. This was true particularly for Wen, who spent much of his career rising up through the central bureaucracy. So as a result, the Hu-Wen years were marked by a reliance on the state for political support rather than an ability to discipline the state. And they were marked by an expansion of the Beijing bureaucracy's influence. We can see this reliance in Wen Jiabao's failed efforts to restructure the central bureaucracy. In 2003, there were early reports that there would be several ministries that would be eliminated as part of his restructuring. But in the end, only one ministry was cut. In 2008, there was another restructuring. Plans to create an energy super ministry were in the end derailed due to domestic opposition. Instead, what we see during the Hu-Wen years is the rise of very powerful industrial policy agencies, such as the NDRC, the Ministry for Industry and Information Technology, MIIT, and also SASAC that oversees China's central SOE assets. Now, at the same time that this party-state accountability shifted in the Hu-Wen years, the strength of external WTO leverage also started to decline, particularly after 2005, as many of the commitments in China's accession protocol were met. This led to a loss of momentum within the bureaucracy, and instead China's international obligations started to be ignored. The many commitments that China signed on to also generated a lot of resentment within the bureaucracy that led to this accumulation of opposition to reform. And for example, China's chief negotiator, Long Yongtu, was even accused of being a traitor that had sold out the country. And these forces meant that industrial policy agencies gained influence, while technocratic agencies lost ground. And what I'll show you here in this next figure is the number of industrial regulations issued by China's economic policy agencies and by China's State Council over time. And you'll see that from around 2005 onwards, there's this dramatic increase in the policy activism by the NDRC. And 2008, after the administrative restructuring and the formation of the MIIT, a big surge in the industrial policies issued by the MIIT. So you just see this big policy activism happening from 2005 onwards. What were these policies that were being issued? And there were a number of important policies policy changes happening during this period. So one important set of policies were put forward in the 11th five-year plan in 2006, which focused on indigenous innovation. And that basically meant a set of guidances that privileged Chinese firms over foreign ones. Another set of policies was the medium to long-term plan that advocated reducing China's reliance on foreign technology. Announcements by SASAC reinforcing the role of SOEs in China's core and pillar industries in 2006, and regulations giving procurement priority to Chinese-made products. Now, the accumulation of all of these policy changes all around the same period of time were met with negative reactions by the foreign business community in China. And that impact can clearly be seen in this graph that I'm showing right now that shows the changes in business sentiments in the American Chamber of Commerce, AmCham's annual survey of its firms in China. In the initial years after WTO entry, we see a very large majority of these foreign firms saying that they've benefited to a great extent or even to a very great extent from Chinese economic reform. This number falls dramatically from 2005 and 2006 onwards. Note that these sentiments are even more negative in 2005, 2006, prior to the onset of the global financial crisis than during the crisis years. So the negative impact can be seen very clearly in the data. So to kind of round out this chapter, counter to the popular perceptions, the rise of Chinese state capitalism actually predated the financial crisis. What the financial crisis did do, right, obviously it did have a big impact. What it did do was to deepen and further entrench the shift towards statism that was already happening. More importantly, this shift in trajectory was not necessarily the result of a coordinated China Inc. master plan, but the product of a shift domestically in party-state accountability relations, and combined with the external loss of WTO leverage that affected the distribution of power within China's central bureaucracy. So what then were the implications of this shift for Chinese industrial policy? The final empirical chapter of the book turns to look at China's quest for national champions. So as China's central government turned towards state capitalism, one logical question would be, does that mean that China's industrial policy became a lot more coherent in these later years in China's strategic sectors? The book argues that rather than disciplining the state, WTO liberalization generated greater policy conflict between the central and subnational states. And this conflict was specifically widened through a foreign direct investment or FDI channel, as foreign capital surged into China with its entry into the WTO. While both central and subnational governments seek to attract FDI, as many governments do, each deploys FDI towards a very different political purpose, and that leads to conflict. So the two key factors that matter here in the overall framework are firstly, what's the goal of the FDI? Is it to maximize capital, or is it to maximize access to technology? And secondly, is it the central government or the subnational government who holds the contracting authority for FDI? Now, the goal of FDI matters because growth is a political target, as it is in China and in other countries. It serves different political purposes for different actors within the state. For the central state, the central state seeks economic growth for regime promotion purposes. WTO entry, therefore, represents an opportunity to strengthen the Chinese regime by accessing foreign technology. Subnational leaders, in contrast, seek economic growth for rank promotion purposes to advance up the CCP hierarchy. For them, WTO entry represents an opportunity for political advancement by drawing in foreign capital to spur growth in their jurisdiction. Therefore, it matters whether the authority for contracting FDI is centralized or delegated to subnational governments, because this affects whether it's the technology component or the capital component of FDI that's being privileged in a strategic industry. Now, the book explores the effects of FDI in two case studies comparing the automotive and semiconductor industries. In the automotive sector, FDI was relatively more centralized, with foreign investment controlled via joint venture rules that have been consistently in place since the 1980s. In the semiconductor sector, in contrast, FDI policy had a lot more changes over time. So I'll just elaborate a little bit on the semiconductor case study. FDI policy for semiconductors in the initial years in the 1980s very much resembled that for the automotive sector, with joint venture rules in place, foreign partnerships closely controlled by the central government. In the 2000s, a new policy was issued that greatly decentralized FDI authority down to the localities, and the joint venture rule was lifted, which led to a surge in foreign investment. This FDI surge, however, was largely focused on low-end aspects of semiconductor manufacturing, on assembly and testing. It had very little R&D. It had very little R&D focus. It had very little high value-added content, and this meant that this type of investment really served just the short-term output maximizing goals of many subnational governments who are seeking rank promotion, rather than the technology upgrading regime promotion goals of the central government. In fact, what you'll find is that Chinese firms located in places with heavy FDI presence found it very difficult to break into these foreign enclaves, and innovation was actually weaker in places with stronger FDI presence. And in response to the situation, the central government in the 2010s or so reasserted central control over semiconductor policies, set up a central investment fund, and rolled out a series of policy initiatives to support Chinese semiconductor firms. And foreign firms found that they were increasingly needing to partner with Chinese firms to access any state resources. And effectively, this meant a swing back to the joint venture models of the 1980s. In short, globalization weakened rather than strengthened Chinese industrial policy, especially in semiconductors. What WTO entry did was to give subnational governments greater access to foreign capital, giving them resources to bypass central policies that emphasized qualitative upgrading. Globalization therefore supercharges the tensions that have long complicated the central government's relationship with subnational units. Beijing's high-tech ambitions have in fact been hobbled by subnational governments by their quantitative rather than qualitative approach to growth. So I hope the findings and arguments that I've presented today allows us to revisit this new conventional wisdom that has coalesced around China's relationship with the global trading system. Rather than asserting that the WTO has failed to alter China's economic model, I've shown that different parts of China's vast state apparatus, in fact, responded differently to WTO entry. Much liberalization was pushed forward by the central government, but subnational governments adopted divergent trajectories. And to the fears that China has been building a state capitalist model, I hope to have persuaded you that the turn towards state capitalism was not the product of a coordinated China incorporated strategy. Rather, it was the product of domestic and international politics. Domestically, the Hu Wen administration had a different accountability relationship with its central bureaucracy, giving central agencies greater influence in relative terms in policymaking. Internationally, the amount of external leverage to be used by technocratic agencies declined over time, and that allowed greater space for industrial policy agencies to assert themselves and to drive the surge in what's become called state capitalism. And finally, to the charge that China's state capitalist model is now being exported globally through state-owned champions, I suggest that globalization has in fact supercharged China's fragmented politics, weakening the overall coherence of industrial policy. So to conclude, while China is an authoritarian one-party state, its engagement with the international economy is far from monolithic. Instead, there's active competition within China between different modes of economic governance. Rather than constraining or disciplining the state, WTO entry altered the distribution of power within China's fragmented authoritarian system, triggering responses that diverged not just over space, but over time and across industries. The narratives that frame China's WTO experience in terms of simple success versus failure not only cannot capture these varied internal effects, they also don't allow us to learn from why liberalizing reform was stronger in some parts of the state than others, and in some periods instead of others. So that's the talk. I'm obliged to do a little bit of book promotion at the moment. I'm super excited. The book just came out. And if you're interested in purchasing the book, Cornell has very kindly provided a discount of 30% if you buy the book online on the Cornell University website. If you prefer to read digitally, the book's also on Amazon. You can buy a Kindle edition there or the hardcover. With that, I thank you very much for your patience in listening to my talk, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
Thanks a lot, Yeling. So I'm going to do what I normally do and ask the first question and then turn it over to the other participants. And participants should know, Daniel, tell them again how they can ask questions.
For all those interested in putting a question to our speaker, please incorporate that question into the Q&A tab that's at the bottom of your Zoom link, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Thank you so much.
Okay, so Yeling, I let you anticipate this question before your talk. I really love the project. It's developed quite a bit since the last time I heard it presented. So congratulations on that. And my question, you covered some of it perhaps, and that is that I noticed that your machine learning research about verbiage between comparing central government and provincial and local are based on data from the reform era up to 2014. So I wonder if in the Xi Jinping era, which really starts 2012 to 2013, so isn't quite captured by that data, whether you would see the same amount of divergence between the center and the localities in how they deal with interfacing with the international economic environment, or whether you'd expect more central control now, and maybe those differences have gone away. And I know that one of the questioners who's already lined up anticipated part of my question, which is this could become very important as China has just applied to join the CPTPP. Will that experience be similar to the 2001 experience, or will it be different because of the centralization of power over the economy and over the polity by Xi Jinping as a strong leader you had portrayed who and when as relatively weak and dependent on others. It doesn't appear that Xi Jinping is that weak and dependent on others, at least on the surface. So I just wonder how much of this you'd have to adjust. Even if you were explaining those early periods, that would be a huge success. So it's not a question of the value of the project, but how much of it's going to carry into a new era of state centralization, state emphasis by the central leadership, and a move, what seems to be a move at least, away from market economics and foreign influence.
Yeah, these are fantastic questions. And I'm excited to talk about them. These are, I think these are exactly sort of the most relevant questions that we should be thinking about at the moment, right? So in terms of, what we've seen play out in the second half of the first 10 years of the Xi period, there's obviously been a lot of centralization. I actually wrote about this with my co-author Kyle Jaros in an article in the China Journal. And what we look at in this paper is why, despite centralization in the Xi Jinping period, subnational governments nevertheless play a very important role in economic policy making. And the argument that we make is that we should move away from thinking about power as flowing in a zero-sum fashion within the Chinese system. So yes, a lot of power has been concentrated upwards. That does not mean that therefore there's less power in lower levels of government, right? And in fact, counterintuitively, as the power shifts upwards, right, it used to be that a lot of economic policy discretion lay with cities, prefectures, and so on at the lower levels of the hierarchy. As the authority is centralized upwards, what happens is that provinces have become more important and more influential policy players and more gatekeepers in the Xi Jinping China, right? Because the central government, oftentimes, right, it has always been rather overburdened in terms of being, it can't oversee everything all the time with the same high level of attention. Central government has been chronically overstretched. This has only become more of a problem in Xi Jinping's China. This means that the provincial governments find themselves playing more influential roles as gatekeepers, right? They get to direct the resources that have been concentrated upwards, right? As the resources get channeled, they get to say, okay, I want this locality to get more of the money than this locality, right? And that leads to different types of inequalities playing out in the economic system. So the hierarchical politics, I would say, very much is still in play in Xi Jinping's China. In terms of the other types of internal fragmentation, right, how does that play out in this era of centralization? I think what we have to look at is, first of all, not just the centralization in that Xi Jinping has conducted, but also the weak external environment in terms of WTO leverage being very, very weak, right? The efforts to conclude the Doha round have failed. And so what has happened instead is that instead of the external environment allowing for a politics of engagement, the external environment has shifted to a politics of coercion, right? With the trade war and tariffs and so on being levied on China. That has implications for domestic politics in the central government, right? So whereas the WTO negotiating period empowered the liberalizing technocratic agencies, the politics of coercion that we see today empowers a different set of actors, right? It empowers the industrial policy agencies who say, this is why we need more control over the economy. It empowers the hawks in the bureaucracy who say, this is why we need to securitize our economic policy, right? And it really narrows the scope for the agencies or economists or thinkers who would prefer to see more domestic liberalization in the economy. So the framework, I think, very much speaks to the current period, right? In terms of there being differential responses across different levels of the economy, and also in terms of the external environment shaping domestic politics, which then shapes China's economic policies outwards.
Right, I get it. It's a great answer, but for me, like all good answers, it raises more questions. And I'm going to turn to Isaac Carden in a minute, but I think he's going to talk about a similar topic, which is what you just described about sort of enforcement mechanisms in the state becoming more powerful because of the centralization. That's going to pose big problems for China then if it joins the CPTPP, because the standards of liberalization in the CPTPP, particularly with foreign investment, are relatively high. So I wonder, is there a kind of functionalist explanation? It's precisely why it's going to be a good thing for China to join the CPTPP, because it's going to provide them an externally driven reason to stop the process you just described, in the way that the WTO provided Zhurongji some leverage to change that environment. But in this case, I just wonder whether Xi Jinping isn't just the key determining factor. Does he really want to go that route? Does he want to reduce his control? And if he doesn't, who's going to stop him? So I just a thought process that I have. And I think that, Isaac says I asked his question. That's not good, Isaac, stay in there. I'm fascinated by this, and I'll just say as a background, and I'll let Isaac come in anyway, even if he's saying he's not going to. As background, I was in the US government when we started to negotiate the TPP, and the thought process that we had was that at the time, it wasn't about pivoting and it wasn't about containing. It was that the TPP was a high standard economic agreement because Singapore was one of the creators of it. It wasn't an American idea at all. It was 4 members of APEC, non-American members of APEC, who thought the Doha round was too slow and we should go further than the WTO would allow. And we thought Singapore has really, really high standards. So if they're in it, it's going to be a really good agreement. And if we can get more countries on board, Japan and others, eventually we'll have enough countries to really make China jealous. And then China will be jealous, and then China will have to open up in order to join. And the goal was to get China to open up. And now we're in this bizarre situation where China's applied to join the CPTPP, and the successor institution, if you will, when the U.S. had pulled out. And the U.S. isn't involved at all, and maybe China will make the U.S. jealous. That's a sort of a side note. But do you think the CPTPP could have the liberalizing impact that we believed it might have way back when, in early 2008, before the financial crisis, when WTO accession was still widely seen as a success for the United States, at least in a pro-trade Republican administration? What do you think is the result, and will it impact China's trajectory in some way? I know that it's a big thing about it's hard to research the future, but I'm just fascinated about the potential implications of your form of research for this question.
It's super interesting, right? That the dynamics, in some ways, have been the same since the CPTPP was the TPP, and in some ways have shifted. Back when it was just the TPP, the policy debate within China was actually very similar to the days of WTO entry negotiation, right? It was, could we use this agreement to push forward liberalization in some of those sectors that were the sticking points in WTO entry, right? Like insurance, telecommunications, some of the sectors that have sort of remained very much protected by the state. And, could this be the second impetus that we could use, right? So there's definitely a parallel attempt to use these external rules to push forward domestic reform. And China's not the only country that does this, right? Other countries around the world seek this kind of external leverage as well. And, anecdotally, I have heard that, a bunch of more liberal-minded economists within China have been examining the TPP in great detail because of the potential. And I think where this may or may not clash, does this clash with, or does this coincide with Xi Jinping's economic agenda? I think there's a way in which you can thread the needle really finely that it does merge in a sense, right? So if we think about the dual circulation policy that a lot of people have been talking about, most of the media coverage around dual circulation has focused on how this means that the Chinese government is now focusing on the domestic economy as the main driver of growth. But don't forget, it's a dual circulation policy, right? The external environment remains important, and external circulation remains part of the overarching strategy. It's a little bit like 抓大放小, right? When that reform policy was being rolled out, everybody focused on 放小, right? Everybody was like, oh, SOEs are being, demolished and privatized. Nobody focused on the 抓大, right? Like, there's a consolidation drive. Like, there are two things happening at the same time. And for the Chinese government, I would say that globalization and relying on and being able to engage externally in terms of economic trade has been successful for the Chinese economy for so many years. They're not about to abandon this strategy, right? What they're doing is recalibrating. China has not stopped signing FTAs, right? It's signed a whole series of FTAs. It's pushing the economic liberalization agenda, and the CPTPP fits within that, right? In the sense that the Chinese government's not about to close itself off entirely. What it's doing in the dual circulation strategy is calibrating, right? It's building greater resilience into its overall economy by focusing on greater sheltering in high-tech security sectors, but not in overall trade. So I think that's where sort of the liberalizing potential of the CPTPP merges with the overall dual circulation strategy. So if you're like a policy entrepreneur in China, you would say, well, this is part of dual circulation, right? We're diversifying our trade links because the CPTPP doesn't include the US, right? We're building more resilience into our networks.
So precisely because the United States is not involved, you can sell it as a liberalizing Chinese official by saying that it's diversifying our sources of especially technological components to join that organization. But what if you're a Japanese official, Yeling? I mean, put yourself in the position of an economic policymaker in Japan. Japan has become the leader of the CPTPP because the United States is absent. I'll just show my own cards and say I think that's unfortunate that it's now a bipartisan consensus that this is a bad idea. But Japan took the lead on it. It kept the standards pretty high, as far as I can tell, for joining the organization. Why wouldn't they be afraid that, oh yeah, there's dual circulation and liberalizers in China can claim that they're doing something consistent with the great leader's wishes by supporting dual circulation, half of which is foreign engagement. But at the end of the day, the big thing that's novel in the TPP and then the CPTPP is a prohibition on excessive state subsidies for industries that are competitive. So how are you going to stop Xi Jinping from subsidizing state champions when he seems to be much more socialist than his predecessors on that score? And isn't there a danger that the entire organization will have its standards watered down in order to accommodate China rather than having China liberalize in order to join the organization?
Yeah, I think the negotiations are going to be really, really difficult. I mean, China's not about to join the CPTPP tomorrow. I mean, even negotiations to agree to open negotiations will take some time. And I think, excuse me, the accession process will be very tricky precisely for the reasons that you've outlined, right? This requires not just a greater restraint around subsidies, it also requires commitments around ensuring the free flow of data. It requires commitments around ensuring that SOEs behave on commercial terms. It requires higher standards on intellectual property. It requires higher
labor as well,
labor standards, environmental standards. So it's, and I think Japan will be one of the countries that will be very much in front of the line in terms of imposing and arguing for maintaining and maybe even raising these high standards rather than watering them down, and maybe even looking into special enforcement mechanisms that might be China specific, right? Mm-hmm. If I were a Chinese trade official, I'd be concerned about, not just negotiating with Japan, but also Australia and also Canada, right? I mean, especially the Australia relationship is so fraught. I'm by no means an expert, but how, what China is asking from Australia is a little bit difficult, considering how fraught their economic relationship has become over the past few years, where China has shown that it's not afraid to politicize the trade relationship over something completely not related to trade. The Australian government calls for an investigation, and all of a sudden they find that their wine and their other products are being blocked. So the overall environment is extremely difficult. I mean, I think we're going to be we're not about to see the accession happen anytime soon.
So I want Isaac to come in. I know he said no, and he said he would. I asked his question, so I wanted to come up with a different one, but I'll ask one more because there's not a lineup today for the Q&A. And that is, maybe it's an unfair question because it's not really the basis of your research, but it touches upon your research, which is, what do you think the United States should do? Like, two questions, right? You often hear China joining the WTO was bad for the United States, right? That was a bad thing. I don't believe that. I'll just tell you, I don't believe that. I think it was a good thing, and I think you can statistically show that China joining the WTO benefited the United States. But it's a very common view, right? So then you can answer that question or not, whether you think the United States, China joining the WTO is good for the United States over time. But in the spirit of that question, whether you want to answer it or not, should the United States get back involved in CPTPP negotiations now that China has expressed an interest in being there? And what's the difference for China? What's the difference if the US is in or not? You suggested before that maybe liberalizers would get more out of the opportunity if they could make the case the US wasn't involved, but maybe someone else would come back and say, well, the whole organization has more leverage with the US in it to make a difference in China. So I just wonder, what would you advise the Biden administration to consider maybe after the midterm elections of 2022, since it's controversial?
Yeah, it's really interesting if we think about American trade policy and how much it's swung around in the past 20 years, right? I mean, there's been, and I agree with you, Tom, and there's been some very influential economics research also. If you're familiar with the China shock research by David Otter and et al. At MIT, where they showed that after China joined the WTO, the surge of cheap imports into various parts of America really led to a lot of disruption in manufacturing, a lot of different sectors suffering from import competition and shutting down. And the localized effect of that was not just in terms of job loss, but also in terms of greater social dislocation and greater political polarization, right? Mm-hmm. So those parts of America that were hit by Chinese imports not only lost jobs, but there was a greater political polarization, more support for Trump and more support for Bernie in mm-hmm. those places. So that sort of research, I think, has really fed into the broader, meta discussion about China and the WTO and how that was bad. That sort of research only looks at imports, right? It doesn't look at exports.
Exports. That's a big problem. It's a big problem, right? So lots of economists, including our own Shangjin Wei at Columbia, has written extensively on that problem in that research and mm-hmm. how intermediate goods are being sold to China. And the other pieces is not just imports, it's that China joins the WTO and foreign direct investment in the region into China increases, which means that products that may have been made in third countries before are now made in China. So it's probably not accurate to say that those jobs in those areas in the United States that were supplanted, which is a serious economic and political problem for those people for sure, wouldn't have happened anyway with Vietnamese and Indonesian and Malaysian products that just happen to be Chinese end products, but it's a transnational production chain. And if you forget about the transnational production chain, it kind of poisons the research, right?
Yeah. So overall, there was overall job creation. This is not to diminish the dislocation that definitely happened, but that kind of dislocation, we've known that this is a result of trade for decades, right? This is not a new academic or policy insight. I think the lesson that should be learned from this set of research is how you conduct trade policy really matters. It's not so much that, China joined the WTO and therefore, bad things happened in the United States. The question that the American officials should be asking, and I think they are to a certain extent, is where's the cushion, right? Where's the support for those who have lost their jobs as a result of trade dislocation? What was happening? Why is the TAA, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, why did it not work the way we thought it would work? And what can we do to make, economic and social policies within the US more, to be complementary with trade, right? This sort of like trade is good or bad is totally the wrong question. The question is, how do you structure your trade policy to be complementary with your social policy? Right. And I think that conversation should be happening as part of the CPTPP conversation. It's not, do we join or do we not join the CPTPP? It's, how do you join the CPTPP? What sorts of complementary policies need to be put in place?
Right. And we liked the labor back in 2008. We liked the labor parts that were in there, even though it was a Republican administration for precisely this reason. But that it seems just as an editorial note, and we'll turn to Isaac, and I think Yuan has a question as well. It seems to me, just as an editorial note, that that's largely a failure of American domestic policy in adjusting to a globalized world, rather than it is a problem with globalization itself. It's more that we haven't put in place the domestic cushions, as you put it, to people who are dislocated, rather than, we should cut off trade. But I've asked you too many questions. Isaac is back in the game, I see. And then Yuan has a question. I'll turn it over to Daniel to handle this part.
Isaac is back in the game. And just for those who don't know, Isaac is an alumni of the program as well. He graduated in the 2016-2017 year and is now a professor at the U.S. Naval War College. And he asked another question: how much does the structure of WTO determine the PRC's reaction? My very limited understanding of CPTPP is that it is structured much differently than the WTO, especially in the sense of not having a fundamentally open institutional design. For example, I believe Australia or Canada, or any other member for that matter, could unilaterally hold up a PRC accession. Is that true?
Right. It's not that different. The CPTPP is an open trade agreement in the sense that any country can apply to join. And in that sense, that's similar to the WTO. And for WTO accession, the most important country that China needed to get on board when it was applying to join the WTO was obviously the United States. And once the US-China bilateral agreement for joining the WTO was signed in 1999, sort of the other ducks were all lined up. Basically, it became a lot easier to negotiate with the EU and so on and so forth, right? And China sort of bilateral negotiations with all the WTO members. WTO members at the point of WTO entry, there were certain exceptions that WTO members could adopt if they did not want China to be in the organization. None of them actually did that. So I don't think the accession dynamics are that different, in that if individual countries such as the US or blocs such as the EU wanted to hold up WTO accession, they could, right? The WTO is a consensus organization, so it does require unanimity in many of its decisions. And so I think the same dynamics will apply in the CPTPP, in that China will need all the members to be on board, just as it needed all the major players to be on board in the WTO case as well.
Maybe your next book will be about the CPTPP.
It needs to be, China needs to get in first. That might take a number of years. It took 15 years for China to join the WTO. I think a lot of people overlook how long and arduous that process was. It was by no means a foregone conclusion. And looking into the history of it, it was fascinating, because the negotiations could have, they did fall apart multiple times. In Beijing, and they fell apart in April of 1999 when Zhongji flew to the US and was hoping to unveil this great agreement. It was a series of failures that finally led to success. It was not a smooth process at all.
Hindsight's always a little bit clearer somehow. The next question comes from Yuan Wang, who's a current CWP fellow, recent graduate with a PhD from the University of Oxford. She asks, does China's corporate actors like state-owned enterprises play any role, or what role do they play in liberalizing central or regional regulations?
Yuan, could you elaborate a little bit on the question? So is there an example that you're thinking of for central or regional regulations?
I don't know, she hasn't responded. We can always jump to, oh, here we go. No.
Someone came in. But we don't have it. We don't, you have to say who you are, right? So we don't do anonymous attendees.
Yeah. In the meantime, can you give a sort of a brief explanation or give more context for the assessment of the PRC-ROK trade and investment relationship now and prospects going forward? It's a bit off topic, but.
So yeah, so an assessment of these trade relationships and investment as well. I mean, sorry, I'm thinking about various aspects here, but I mean, in general, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, the Chinese government has not turned away from globalization, and it's very much looking to strengthen its trade relationships rather than weaken them with many countries, especially in the Asia Pacific. Is that a broad enough answer? It's a fairly broad question, but I can try and go into greater detail if there's sort of a particular aspect that you're interested in.
They didn't. Well, so the follow-up from China has been getting the stronger hand in that relationship. Is that likely to continue? That was what the person responded.
Mm-hmm.
Yuan Wang also followed up with her question with a little bit more detail. Maybe labor and environmental practices. So do you observe SOEs wanting to promote their own good practices to policy space? That was in relation to the state-owned enterprises playing a role in liberalizing central and regional regulations.
All right. Yeah, I mean, to Yuan's question, I guess the way I would think about this question is in terms of which SOEs and which sectors you're talking about, particularly if some of these SOEs are globally oriented, right? They might face more pressure, depending on which countries they're invested in. They might face more pressure on raising the labor and environmental practices in countries that have strong state capacity and with a strong civil society that might push for greater labor and environmental practices. So I think that it very much depends on which sectors you're looking at and what sorts of pressures these SOEs are under. In terms of, central policies around the environment have obviously strengthened in recent years, right? So the whole push towards creating this quote unquote ecological civilization. So China's taking climate change really seriously now. That has translated into policies that not just SOEs, but other firms will have to abide by. So you could think of SOEs as pushing stronger environmental policies from that point of view. There's also the industrial policy angle to it, in the sense that wind energy and solar power, these are now big industrial policy priorities for the central government. And some of these companies are in these sectors are private, but some of these are state-owned as well. So you could think of state-owned enterprises in these renewable energy spaces as being part of a suite of actions that are strengthening environmental and climate change action in China. That's one way of thinking about it, I guess.
Question from a student from Georgetown, graduate student at the McDonough School of Business, who asked, does China's negative list moving from 40 to 33 in the 2020 lead support to the point that China is continuing to promote foreign engagement?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say something about the question, just so the audience will know. A negative list is a list of sections of your economy that foreigners cannot invest in. So if you have a negative list, it means the implication, at least, is that you can invest in everything else that's not on the negative list. And the questioner is asking you, Yeling, since China's negative list has shrunk, is this a sign of your interpretation of dual circulation as including opening up to the outside world, supported by that? I think that's a fair interpretation of the question. Just as a technical term that I don't know if everyone would know, but go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. The negative list has been a subject of long and arduous negotiations. Some of the sticking points in the negative list are the very same sectors that were sticking points in China's WTO negotiations. So the fact that they managed to narrow it down is definitely positive news in my view, at least, right? That as far as the difficult negotiations around these things, there's always there's always these entrenched opposition to removing one sector from the negative list, right? Because that means there are no longer restrictions on foreign investment, right? And so the fact that they've managed to reduce it, I think is definitely, I would think the business community would read this as positive news, right? That it is possible that China is opening up to greater foreign investment and reducing the types of restrictions that they're placing on foreign investment, which have traditionally been very, highly calibrated through their guiding policy for foreign investment. The guiding
just say as background, Yeling, and for Vincent's excellent question, it was actually a breakthrough for the Obama administration to actually get China to accept the idea of a negative list. So for a very long time, when we were negotiating bilateral investment treaties, back when the United States used to do that with China, they wouldn't accept the idea of a negative list. It was only a positive list, which means China would identify the areas where you could invest and you couldn't invest anywhere else. And we were trying to convince them just to accept the idea. No, come up with a negative list where we can invest and let everything else go. And it took a long time, but they finally came around to it. And now, as Vincent points out, they've made that a smaller set of industries that are where foreign direct investment is prohibited. All countries have some. China has many, and now it has fewer. Okay, so Daniel, over to you for the next questioner.
Absolutely. The next question comes from another current CWP fellow, Hong Zhang, who also recently came to us from the George Mason University. She asks, I wonder if the Chinese policymakers' key concern have changed, which might affect their calculations of how to approach the international trade regimes. Back in the 1990s, the key concern for the reformers seemed to be enhancing the competitiveness of domestic industries. But now, do you think they're relatively confident in that and more concerned about opening up markets in other parts of the world that may affect how they will structure the negotiation process? Or will that affect the structure of the negotiation process?
Yeah, I think that's a really good set of comments and a great question, for sure, right? Back in the 1990s, one important thing to realize is that Chinese exports were already receiving very low tariffs back in the 1990s. So most developed countries were already allowing in Chinese exports with very low tax, right? The key about China's WTO accession was access to China's domestic market. Right, it was about lowering China's own import tariffs. That was, and the entire negotiation, the tariff schedule was, very, very detailed, pages and pages long in terms of how much tax to lower for the exports of foreign countries into China, and that was the key dynamic in WTO accession. If we're talking about CPTPP. Today, some of that dynamic will also be really salient in that countries will be looking, for greater access to China's domestic market. But at the same time, because Chinese outward investment is now more lively, I think that's the key difference, right? Back in the 1990s, China was not exporting capital in that same sense, right? Outward investment of Chinese companies was very, very low. That's the key difference in dynamic between then and now. So I think that I've lost your question now in the chat box, but I think that is the key difference.
There's another question. There are too many challenges on the part of China without a substantial improvement in its relationship with the US led West. China will not be so enthusiastic about integrating its economy further into the world economy. How likely do you think US-China relations will come back to the right track in the foreseeable future? Or any version of a more stable relationship, maybe is the better way of putting it.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's the unusual thing about China's application to join the CPTPP, right? It comes in the context of a lot of acrimony between China and some of the major CPTPP countries, right? With Australia, with Canada, and it comes in the context of an ongoing and never-ending trade war between the US and China, a trade war that's not just about tariffs, but also about technology restrictions, export restrictions. And so I think that China has been engaging in a diversification strategy, right? For several reasons, right? The first is to reduce its reliance and sense of vulnerability vis-a-vis the US. So strengthening trade relationships with other countries, with smaller countries, with more countries in the Asia Pacific and in the African region and Latin American region, right? So China is very pro-trade in that sense. And that's part of the external circulation part of the dual circulation strategy. But the diversification strategy only works up to an extent, right? The main question of US-China economic relations is still the most important one to fix. And their one issue is that the US administration right now is domestically focused, right? And for good reason. It's focused on its own version of industrial policy. And it's focused on the Biden version of the Green New Deal. So with at least for the next few years, with the US administration sort of looking inward and either holding steady or maybe even escalating in terms of its economic relationship with China, that's going to continue to create a lot of uncertainty in the global economy. And even though the US is not in the CPTPP, major CPTPP countries are very much economically integrated with the United States. And so you can't disentangle these dynamics, right? It will seep into CPTPP negotiations in an indirect, if not direct fashion. So I think this question is really important, right? The broader context does not bode well.
Well, thanks a lot, Yeling. I think we have to wrap up because we're approaching 6 o'clock. And thank you to the questioners and all the participants. It was a good turnout today on a beautiful day here in New York. And really appreciate your excellent talk. It's great that the book is coming out. Congratulations. And we always were proud of you, and we remain proud of you at China in the World. It's great to have such excellent scholars in the community. And please, Yeling, especially since we have a few fellows this year working on economic issues, our 3 fellows, please engage with them
For sure.
and help them along as well. Okay, thanks a lot.
Quick housekeeping note, our next talk is 2 weeks from now, October 4th, and we will have Ryan Haas giving a talk for us. So feel free to follow us on our newsletter or look for information on our website. And thank you again to our speaker, Yeling Tan.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks everyone for the great questions. And thank you, Daniel.
Bye, everybody. Have a great week.
Bye.